What's up everybody and welcome to another edition of AGR's Pop Culture Reviews, and I'm sorry it took me a little while to get this review out, but world events happen. I mentioned this in my previous video about what's going on in Nicaragua and I just wanted to raise awareness of it, but I do realize that I do have to get these reviews out, so we're going to continue on with the review, but I don't want to make light of what's going on in Nicaragua right now because it is important for us to know. Now, like you guys, I grew up on the God of War series. I loved them, they were absolutely amazing. Yes, they were pretty rudimentary in terms of their hack and slash nature, and playing this game was actually very interesting. You can see where the evolution of the series has gone. It's much more mature and much more thoughtful. It's interesting because this is a very unique hybrid of a game in that it stays true to some of those very basic hack and slash origins, and yet it's much more substantial in terms of its overall narrative. And having prefaced all that, let's take a closer look at God of War. Having played my last God of War game nearly a decade ago, it's hard to remember if this has an exact continuity to the previous games. Something tells me though that it really doesn't, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. In that respect, I wouldn't really call this a reimagining, so to speak, instead of a natural progression as I mentioned before. There are clues and subtle hints throughout the game though that make reference to the previous games, and it makes it a little more interesting in terms of creating the overall narrative. There are, however, some very significant differences between this Kratos. Whereas the previous title took place mostly in the Greek mythos, this one does a completely different thing, and we are thrust deep head-on into Norse mythology. This Kratos is a very different character, taking a much more humanistic approach, or at least as human as one can be, being a deity of war. Kratos is also a father, and a grieving one at that, which made a much more compelling character, even though at times he seems a little stale, but his companion or son Atreus is what counterbalances this very unique and special relationship throughout the game. The father and son relationship here works very well, and it is an excellent dynamic in this game. Conceptually, there's also been a very big major overhaul. Whereas the previous games, Kratos was able to use multiple weapons and multiple abilities, this one really streamlines it, and really you only have a single battle axe. But that doesn't mean that the combat is rudimentary in any way, and it's actually one of the great things about it. The angles are also different as well, where the other games were true third-person hack and slashers. This one takes the Resident Evil 4 kind of perspective, and it's more over the shoulder. I also have to say this Kratos takes a couple of cues from Thor, in that he can throw his axe anywhere he wants, and he can retrieve it automatically, and that never got old. Combat in this game is oh so satisfying, not to mention very streamlined. Now, as I mentioned before, you don't have the same variety as weapons as you did in the past, but that doesn't mean that it's oversimplified. It's actually very gratifying, and the fact that you can actually upgrade certain abilities throughout the game as you progress is one of the coolest things about it. Kratos has some very unique abilities here, and yes, the rage meter does make a return here, and it's awesome. You're pounding the hell out of these enemies. I also really like the tempo of this game. There are some moments that are very heartfelt, and they are really well done. Now, most of the time you are engaged in these things and you are actually really paying attention because of the emotional connection, but they are punctuated by moments of pure and visceral shock and awe of what just happened. There were so many times when I thought I was safe and I just saw something happen and I had to ask myself, holy shit, did that just freaking happen?
We're gonna fight that?
We have no choice.
I also have to mention that combat in this game has to be a little bit more tactical. You just can't hack and slash your way through certain fights, mostly because enemies, just like Kratos, have different abilities and different strategies to combat you. Fortunately, you have a few options in the settings menu if you find the combat a little bit too difficult. And yes, one of the wonderful things about this game is those amazing finishing moves that have been a staple of the series for so many years. They make a return here, guys, and they are awesome. I also have to mention that this God of War is refreshingly linear, with a little bit of backtracking. Now, before you blow up the comments section, just hear me out for just a second. Now, I realize that linear gameplay is a bit of a nasty word these days in the industry, but here it works perfectly, and true to form, it's a return to some very basic and rudimentary gameplay, which is amazing. It reminds me a lot of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, and why I really like that game. In that respect, it's never overwhelming or daunting, and upgrading Kratos never felt like it was grinding, and it makes progression something to look forward to, just to get to the next stage of the game. Additionally, although it's not an open world game, it is by no means small. God of War doesn't insult your intelligence by assuming that you have some kind of attention deficit disorder, and you guys know what I mean. In most open world games, characters are given a Herculean task to save the world, and yet paradoxically, game developers purposely distract you in order to pad out that game with a lot of mindless side quests of really no consequence, as the world you're playing in is seemingly coming to an end. It's just very jarring, and it really takes you out of the immersion. God of War stays away from this trend and really keeps you on task, and in that respect it gives you a sense of urgency about the task that you're trying to accomplish. Another great thing about this game, and it's something that we hadn't seen before, actually, going back to my Resident Evil 4 reference, the way that you're able to level up your character, your weapons, your armor is pretty interesting. You guys might remember this one. What are you buying? What are you selling? If you remember that, you were definitely a Resident Evil 4 fan, and this is essentially how you upgrade your character here. You have a merchant named Barak, a really foul-mouthed dwarf I might add, and his brother who periodically show up throughout the realms. I don't know, magic? Now the cool thing about this is that there is some RPG elements, and they're pretty robust I might add. You can change the way that you look, and there are certain characteristics and abilities that you have whenever you change armor, weapon sets, etc. The menus here are easy to navigate, there is a bit of a learning curve, but eventually you'll get it. I was also pleasantly surprised at how deceptively rewarding and complex the puzzle solving is in this game. Now it starts off very basic, but as you progress into the game and in the later stages, they get a little bit more complicated without being too frustrating. Overall, they were pretty fun, and you do get a sense of satisfaction once you figure them out. Some puzzles are a little bit of a pain in the ass when you're opening chests, but it's no consequence if you don't open them. But if you are a completist like most gamers, you're gonna want to solve them. Wall crawling, climbing, and platforming is also very satisfying in this game, and there is not too much hand-holding here. Now, you're really in no danger of ever falling from where you're perched from, but it's not simply automated. You do have to look and maneuver in a certain way in order to get to the next vantage point. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and it makes you much more engaged while you're traversing these vast expanses. Similarly, there are certain areas that only Atreus will be able to access, so in that respect it makes it a little bit more cooperative, even though Atreus is an AI. Now, the definite highlight in this game is absolutely the characters that you meet along your adventure, and this was so cool because they are so organic, and I loved how fleshed out they are. They're not just random AIs that you meet and don't have any consequence. These are actually well written, and the dialogue here is so spectacular. Whenever you had these cutscenes, they weren't just mindless fodder for you to look at. You were actually engaged in what they were talking about, the subtle nuances, especially the motion captures, and again, how well written this is makes it that much more engaging. If you recall my review of Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, you'll remember how I remarked on how wonderful they did exposition. It wasn't just dialogue for the sake of dialogue, there was a reason that they were having those discussions. Now, they do this brilliantly here as well, and it's done with the side characters that you meet, which are really great, but most importantly, the dialogue between Kratos and his son Atreus is done so well here, and it gives some humanity to an otherwise stale character. I love Atreus as a character. He is funny as hell, and he's kind of sarcastic at times, somewhat passive-aggressive, but what he is an innocent child asking some very interesting questions about the overall narrative. You'll see what I mean, I don't want to give it away. I think you can already tell how beautiful this game is. I mean, it is stunningly beautiful. Not to mention the art direction, the style is incredible, guys. They did an amazing job of really setting up this world. One of the other things that is really great about this as well is the overall choice of color palette. Now, previous games were a little bit dull and gray. Even though they were in the Greek mythos, it was a little bit kind of stale, so to speak. And don't get me wrong, I love those games. But here, the choice of art direction is brilliant, and it really gives it a sense of vibrancy. I loved this world and these realms, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Not to mention that the game's performance is spectacular. Now, earlier on in the settings, as I mentioned before, you have an option, is you can choose either graphics over performance. It's up to you. Now personally, I think that this game benefits from the performance, the higher frame rates, etc., so I set it to that, but it's nice that they give you an option for that. And guys, just take a look at that. There's a freaking turtle that came out of the ground with a tree on top. Guys, go back into your databanks for a little bit, and if you recall playing those early God of War games and how immense they were in terms of their scale. Well, this game doesn't disappoint. The level of scale in this game is astronomical, and it certainly got me nostalgic for those older games. I mean, it was so incredible. They didn't miss the mark with this one. I mean, the sense of scale in this game is absolutely incredible. From the encounters that you have like this one with the World Serpent, down to some bosses that are enormous and you don't ever think you're going to take them down. Overall, the experience was great, and this is one of the things that is a staple of the series, as I mentioned before, and I'm so glad that it made a return. This was absolutely awesome, guys, and something that I was hoping that they wouldn't lose in the new games.
Yeah. Mom said he's friendly.
What does it say?
I don't know. That was amazing.
I also have to mention how much I love the variety in the game and level design in general. I mean, you truly see some very unique stages here, which is a refreshing thing. Each of the 9 realms have a very distinct look according to Norse mythology, so you're going to experience some of that here. Guys, I really liked the journey that this God of War title took me on. Ultimately, God of War has grown up, it's matured, relying more on its often provocative and thoughtful nuance rather than the proverbial brute force and intrusive over-the-top action to convey this wonderful narrative. It may not be the God of War of our childhood, but you still should give this one a try. Alright everybody, so that's my official review of God of War. As always, I thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next AGR's Pop Culture Reviews.
Wish Mom was here to see it.
Come, boy.